My name is Nayaswami Devarshi, and we're here with this week's reading from Living Wisely, Living Well, written by Swami Kriyananda. The topic this week is From Within, Not From Without. In the reading for November 12th, make no special effort to be stylish. People reveal in modishness their own lack of taste. One wonders if the styles displayed in the fashion sections of newspapers and magazines aren't actually intended to shock. Their message seems to be only, look at me, look even in horror and dismay, but look. It is difficult to imagine a stylish person being humble. Good taste seems to go with understatement. Indeed, understatement is the very essence of good taste. Well, this reading today, it touches on the idea of the clothes one wears, but obviously it touches on much more than that. When we live guided by what other people are doing, then we just go with the trends, and we go with whatever trend is popular, and it may even be a trend that is adharmic in the end. People wonder in World War II how all the people in Nazi Germany got on that bandwagon of something that was obviously very, very evil and slaughtered millions of Jews. But it was a bandwagon of the popular opinion, and others were doing it, and so there was this fervor that they got caught up in. And obviously those who got caught up in it weren't living from within. They were caught up in what was going on outside of themselves. And so they just went with the flow. And sometimes it's good to go with the flow, but sometimes we have no choice. But not when that flow is an evil one. We have to really act from within, from our own center, and be guided by truth. And we'll talk somewhat today about how to do that. My own life, I was guided by this for some reason from an early age. It was very interesting that when I was in high school, I was probably 17 years old, I had a very deep experience of God as divine bliss. And the moment I had that experience, I was starting to read books about yoga. I think I'd read maybe one book about yoga, or possibly two. And I knew instantaneously that what I was feeling is what the yogis were talking about as being God. I knew that this bliss was God. I also knew that this is what Christian saints were talking about when they were in ecstasy. And I made a determination at that moment that I would spend the rest of my life as a yogi seeking God. Now keep in mind that I had never even met a yogi at that point in my life. Where I lived at that time in the United States in the early 1970s, there were no yogis anywhere around that I could find. But I just had this strong, deep inner conviction. And I think that if I would have gone to my friends, family, my counselor at my high school, and told them that I had found my life's vocation, that I was going to become a yogi and seek God, they would have thought I was crazy. I kept it to myself at that time. But I stayed true to that conviction because I knew that it was true. And so as soon as I could, I moved to California, where I knew that there was yogis living here in California. I joke sometimes that California should be like a different country because the consciousness really is quite different from other parts of the United States even. And so I followed that inner conviction because I knew to the very depths of my being, and I didn't know this particular truth, but I knew that this was true, what I was feeling. And it was the best decision I ever made in my life. Now, if I had listened to family, friends, and followed the popular trend, I know that I would have been unhappy following that. Yogananda said something very interesting one time. He said that if you want to find out your life's vocation, he said, look at those things that you were avid and interested in when you were younger. And I don't know that he gave a particular age. And he wasn't obviously talking about, maybe half the young boys in India who might want to become a cricket superstar, or in America, basketball or football. But he was talking about a true interest that you might have had when you were younger. something that you were very avid about. And he said, tune into those, because very often those come from past lifetimes, from samskaras, from impressions, from things that are coming from within. And so he said, be somewhat guided by that, and obviously not a slave to it, but look at those things, and you'll find that if you spend your life doing something that you're avid about, even if it's not maybe necessarily the most highly rewarded profession, that you will become successful in it. And so be guided from within and not by popular convention and by peer pressure. And I think what Yogananda was saying in this regard was that by the time people get to high school and become older, they are starting to be more influenced by their peers, especially in high school. Look how people, the way they dress and the way they act is very often guided by what their friends are doing, and maybe their profession and their career choice is often pushed and persuaded, often against people's will, by what their parents and elders are saying. And yes, we must respect that to some extent, because there is some wisdom in the guidance of those who have experience, but really always be listening to this inner voice inside of ourselves. How do we learn how to do this? The best way is through practicing daily meditation. Daily meditation, what it gives us, because listening to this voice within is not some sort of cosmic closing the eyes and asking God to start talking to us and telling us what we are supposed to be doing with our life. It's really listening inwardly with the voice of our intuition. Intuition, Yogananda said, is when the heart's feelings are calmed and stilled by meditation, and that when we're listening and perceiving through the feelings of the heart that are open, receptive, and calm. He said that in meditation, one way he put it is that the spiritual eye is the sending station, like a radio sending station, sending to God and sending the call to God. And he said the heart is the receiving station, because he said that meditation actually is an experience of communing with God and communing with the divine presence, that happens through intuition, which is through open, developed, calm feeling of the heart. And so meditation, what it does, especially the daily habit of meditation, every morning, every evening, over time what happens, you'll find that you become almost a habit of stilling yourself and listening and attuning through intuition, through calm reason, through an intellect and reason that is also calm. And you'll find that it becomes a habit to become still every morning and evening. It starts to influence your daily life in many ways. And so the daily habit of meditation, and particularly Kriya Yoga, which I'll touch on this in a few moments, are really, really the greatest aids to developing the ability to live from within and to be guided also by intuition and by true guidance. Now, taking it to the furthest extreme of really the goal of all life, which is to achieve moksha, which is union with God. In Yogananda's poem, Samadhi, which he recommended to his disciples, he said, Yogananda did, memorize my poem Samadhi, read it every day. And the reason he said that is that poem gives us a really good intuitive understanding of what the divine experience is like when we achieve that state of samadhi. Because it's not a state that comes through reason or intellect, but by reading the words in poetry, in a way, it is poetry, it gives a feeling of that experience rather than just an intellectual understanding of it. And the reason he said to read it every day was not so that we could intellectually understand it, but that we could almost soak up the vibrations of his words and his own experience of being in samadhi when he wrote that poem. Interestingly, in that poem, almost all of it describes this state of samadhi, where we come from, what we're pulling away from, and what we're merging into. And the poem describes that. But there's one line that gives the answer to how we achieve that state. And it's very interesting because it's a line that was, I'm going to say this line, but I'm warning you ahead of time that it was later edited out after Yogananda left the body. It was edited out of later editions of that poem. And the reason I mention that is only because if you look it up in one of a later edition of his book, you'll find that that line isn't in there, and you'll wonder what the heck Devarshi was talking about. What Yogananda said in the answer to how we reach that state, he said, by deeper, longer, thirsty, guru-given meditation comes this celestial samadhi. By deeper, longer, thirsty, guru-given meditation comes this celestial samadhi. So the answer is meditation. It's interesting that he puts the word deeper first. Sometimes people think longer is more important, deeper is more important. I think I've heard the question many times. People ask, well, how long do people at Ananda meditate? And Swami Kriyananda encouraged really serious Ananda residents to try to meditate, have the goal of about 3 hours a day. That's obviously not always possible with busy lives. But a far more pertinent question, which I don't think I've ever heard asked, is how deep do people at Ananda meditate? And so, however long your meditation is, try to go very deep and spend the time in that depth. An interesting experiment with meditation that I would encourage you to try sometime, Yogananda's Hong Sau technique of meditation is designed to develop concentration and stillness. And I think sometimes people take that technique for granted, and after practicing it for a long time and maybe having a longer meditation, people become very skillful, and I'm speaking from my own experience. You can become very skillful at practicing Hong Sau, concentrating on the mantra, concentrating on the breath, and also concentrating on all kinds of other things, all at the same time, of your day, what your day is going to be like, and problems that you have. Or maybe you just concentrate kind of a little bit haphazardly, and you start going subconscious and start nodding out. And I jokingly call this the Hong Snore technique when you do that. But do this experiment sometime. Practice Hong Sau for, say, just 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, but no longer than that. But really, really, in this particular session of, say, just 5 minutes of Hong Sau, really, really concentrate, really, really deeply. Do it with relaxation, not with trying too hard with tension. Be sure that you're relaxed, but concentrate deeply on the breath and on the mantra Hong Sau, and also just commune with that inner stillness that you're feeling. The techniques that Yogananda gave are very interesting because each one of the main techniques, as part of the path of Kriya Yoga, help us to commune with an aspect of the divine. And Hong Sau helps us to commune with the divine and with really our own higher self as deep peace and calmness. And so do a practice of Hong Sau where for just 5 minutes you're paying deep attention to the breath, to the concentration at the point between the eyebrows, to mentally chanting Hong Sau with the breath, and really concentrating on the vibration of the mantra and just the feeling of deep stillness and calmness, as if what you are communing with the divine through that technique. And you'll find that if you really go deep in just 5 minutes with that practice, you'll go a lot further than if you do the technique for 30 minutes with just a little bit of haphazard effort. Now, obviously, eventually you want to do deeper and longer, but deeper comes first. That's far more important than longer. And then over time, develop the habit of going longer with that same concentration in that deep stillness, in that deep attention. And you'll find that you really start progressing in meditation. And this is, again, is one reason why we practice meditation morning and evening. Because when you have that habit of coming back to meditation twice a day, you'll find that you never get too far from your center, because the day's activities and the stresses and a child crying and the business that we're working with and the stresses of that, it naturally has a tendency to pull us out of our inner self and pull us out into Maya, delusion, and get caught up in this outer reality rather than the inner one. And so if we twice a day come back to our center you'll find that over time, with that twice a day habit, that you never get too far away from your center during the day. And then you'll find very quickly, as soon as you sit down and start practicing a little bit of Hong Sau and the other techniques, you very quickly come back to your center. And so, longer, deeper is extremely important. Thirsty, what does that mean? It means developing that desire for freedom, that desire for moksha, that desire for deep inner communion with the divine, which means cultivating, awakening, developing devotion, developing yearning, calling to God, praying, meditating, and chanting with that divine fervor of wanting to come home to our cosmic beloved. And if you have your meditation practice imbued with that thirstiness, then you will find that that's, in a way, it's the fuel that really drives a lifelong meditation practice. It's when we start doing our practices in a mechanical way, just seeing them as almost sort of technical and impersonal techniques, which they are to some extent. But if we just do it that way, then they become mechanical and dry, and it becomes much more difficult to concentrate and to go deep. And so develop that deep fervor, that deep thirstiness. The last part, which I'm going to talk about more at the end here in a few minutes, is guru-given meditation. Because really the power to meditate comes from and through the guru, as I'll talk about here in a moment. I want to talk about one other aspect of meditation and how this works, especially with Kriya, and talking about this topic today from within, not from without, which is that Kriya Yoga, the reason that Yogananda described it as the most advanced technique of yoga, is that it more directly than any other practice works directly with the flow of energy in the deep astral spine. Most other practices and techniques influence it either indirectly or maybe perhaps more subtly or gently, but Kriya Yoga goes right in there and works almost like, I wouldn't say hand-to-hand combat because it's not a combat, but it works hand-to-hand with that energy in the deep astral spine. Swami Kriyananda often talked about the practice of Kriya. And even with Kriya, he said to practice Kriya from the inside out, meaning, yes, and I'm not going to give the technique because that's only given in initiation, but those of you who practice Kriya will understand what I'm talking about. But even those who don't have Kriya, it applies even just to how we approach life and how we approach meditation. But with the technique of Kriya, what he was saying was work more with the energy. Yes, there's also a technical component to it with the breath and certain things with it, but work with the energy within and make that your main focus. And these other things will actually start to follow and take care of themselves. But you'll find over time that if you practice Kriya Yoga with certain of the qualities that are and components that are part of recommended practice of Kriya, you'll find that practicing, for example, attunement to the Guru during Kriya practice, while you are deep in the astral spine, that when you practice that attunement to the Guru deep inside, while you're practicing Kriya, with an awareness of the Guru's presence, you'll find that as within, so without. And so that deep attunement inwardly will start to find expression in your outer life. In the same way, if you are wanting to develop energy and willpower, if you tune into that quality while you're practicing the Kriya technique, doing it with energy and will, again deep in your astral spine, you'll find that it starts to find outward expression in your life, that energy and will start to find outward expression. It's the same with concentration. When you practice Hong Sau, even with deep attention and concentration, morning and evening, you find that it actually hones and develops concentration in the outer avenues of life in your daily life. And finally, with Kriya especially, but with other techniques of yoga, if you practice it with deep devotional self-offering, Swamiji often said in one of his writings, he said every Kriya should be an act of devotional self-offering, meaning every practice of that technique should be almost like a divine puja, offering oneself into the light of God. And if you practice that deep inner technique with that inner sense of devotion and self-offering, you'll find that the technique of Kriya starts to change you on the inside, and that sense of devotion, offering to God, to others in service, in all that you do, it starts to imbue your outer activities with that same sense of devotion. Bliss is the same way. When you start to feel divine bliss inside, you'll start to express joy outside of yourself. I was very struck when I came to Ananda for the first time. I didn't know yogis, and I didn't know what yogis were like. I think it was probably when I came to Ananda was the first time I actually met yogis. And I had this idea that a saintly yogi, that it was a very serious thing we were doing, which it is in one sense. But I was surprised at first and very delighted by how much joy and the beautiful humor I saw in Swami Kriyananda and in other people at Ananda. Ananda means divine bliss, divine joy. And so when you start practicing techniques of yoga and start attuning yourself inwardly in the deep astral spine to this quality of Satchitananda, ever-conscious, ever-existing divine bliss, you'll find that even your outer life becomes lighter and more joyful. And you will even find, as I've seen over the years, that you can even laugh at situations, circumstances, things and events that previously caused even suffering and pain. And it helps you to see that this life is a dream of God's, and that when we play this role, this play, this movie with God's presence, with devotion, with love, and with this inner feeling of divine bliss, we start to find that divine joy also in outer circumstances. It doesn't mean that the circumstances necessarily change, although I think for most yogis over the course of the years, outer circumstances do change because our magnetism changes, again, from the inside out. But you'll find that you are able to laugh at life's difficulties, challenges, humorous interludes in this great movie that God has given us. And so, again, as within, so without, and work on changing these qualities, changing yourself inwardly, and you'll find that your outer life becomes very, very changed. And again, as I like to say, you'll look in the mirror after 5, 10, 20, 30 years of this type of practice of meditation and Kriya Yoga, and you'll find that you don't even recognize yourself compared to when you had started this whole process. So another way of looking at this is that when we practice Kriya Yoga, we really develop a great deal of magnetism in our deep astral spine. And so our thoughts, our tendencies tend to get drawn within naturally as we act even in our daily life. For most worldly people, and to all of us to some extent, the reason we get caught up in the outer and are too influenced by outer things, and talking about it from the sense of the yoga science, is that the energy is flowing out through the different chakras, rather than the energy flowing into the deep astral spine, the Sushumna, and going up to the spiritual eye. It's flowing outwardly, getting caught up through, say, the heart center, where we get caught up in more intense personal human desire and involvement, or the Manipur center, where it's the center of inward willpower and self-control if it's directed inward, but directed outwardly, when the energy is just flowing down and out, it starts to try to control other people in a very tense way, and starts to try to control life in a type of way that can be unhelpful. And so what Kriya Yoga does especially, but many yoga practices, it creates a very strong magnetism in the deep astral spine, so that our tendencies to go outward and get caught up in the outer event, that flow starts to be reversed naturally. And so that we don't have to fight every battle of being caught up in duality. It just naturally, the magnetism that we develop deep inside of ourselves draws energy, life force, and tendencies deep within ourselves. And so we start more and more naturally, in a very natural way, to act from that center. One of the delightful things over the years of watching Swami Kriyananda, the way he acted, it was very natural. There was nothing artificial about it. When he was working with others or enjoying the beauty of the divine in life, he acted from that deep center, but it was not artificial or stilted. It was very natural because he was very naturally living from that deep center within. Finally, this last part of that talk, of that poem, Samadhi, Guru-given meditation. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda has that experience of Samadhi because he prepared himself, he practiced meditation, he worked at the techniques, but it was through finally the grace of his Guru, Sri Yukteswar, touching him on the heart center, that really, in the end, gave him the final experience of union with God. And so, deep attunement to the Guru. Swami Kriyananda, I heard him say once that techniques of yoga, such as Kriya Yoga, are secondary to attunement and discipleship to the Guru. And so, of course, our ability to practice Kriya deeply and correctly comes through that deep attunement to the Guru. Swami Kriyanandaji was an extraordinary example, perhaps more than anything, of discipleship. His life was dedicated to practicing, to sharing his deep discipleship to Paramhansa Yogananda. And his attunement to Yogananda was the central thing in his life, more than anything else, more than Kriya Yoga, more than meditation, although those things grew from that deep attunement. But when you practice attunement to the Guru, you'll find that his guidance, his wisdom, his power start to guide you and start to change you very, very deeply over time. Swami Kriyananda said that towards the end of his life, he had done such moment-to-moment practice of attunement to the Guru in his service, in his meditation, that he said it was hard to tell where his thoughts began and Yogananda's ended, or vice versa. Their thoughts, his attunement was so deep that he couldn't tell where he was different from Yogananda. And we saw that in his life. When Swamiji met Paramhansa Yogananda, he gave him some very good advice, because people who practice meditation and maybe aren't going deep think they're being guided inwardly by truth, but really it's just they're being guided by their own desires, because truth and untruth are both within us and they spring from within, and we are really trying to find the really deep, true spiritual intuition when we live our life. When Swamiji met Master, Yogananda told him the story of his own meeting with Sri Yukteswar. And he quoted, and I'm quoting from him, Yogananda speaking to Swami Kriyananda from his book, The New Path. And Sri Yukteswar speaking to Yogananda, and Yogananda said, quoting Sri Yukteswar, "In the beginning of the spiritual path, one's will is guided by whims and fancies. Mine was too, until I met my Guru, Lahiri Mahashai. It was only by attuning my haphazard will to his wisdom-guided will that I found true freedom. In the same way, if you attune your will to mine, you too will find freedom. To act only on the inspiration of whims and fancies is not freedom, but bondage. Only by doing God's will can you find what you are seeking." Om Shanti Shanti. Amen.